Well, at the time that I did it, I was 32 years old. I was young and kind of stupid and didn't kind of have a sense. We knew we were doing something historic, but so when I put my hands on it, I'll be honest with you, I expected to arrive in Turin in 78 and take a look with my little 10x magnifier. All photographers carry a loop in their pocket somewhere.
Yeah.
And I expected to take a look and see the paint and the brush strokes and be done and go home and say, well, I went to Italy, It took about 5 minutes after it was laid out before us with my magnifier to realize that in the image areas, there's no particulates, there's no binders, there's no pigment. As a matter of fact, up close, it's very difficult to see the difference between the image and the background. It's only at a distance or when the shroud is photographed and the contrast increased that the image becomes as clear as the familiar image we're used to seeing. So,
do you think, though, Barrie, if you touched it today,
mm-hmm.
would you feel this awe, this incredible feeling?
Well, I'm sort of biased now, George. I mean, I've got 32 years under my belt in studying this object, something I never even wanted to be a part of. We can talk about that. And I would certainly consider myself very privileged, as I do for having been given that first opportunity. When you hold the cloth, I think I was a little surprised at its condition. It was in better condition than maybe I expected it to be in. But you also have to remember this cloth has been cherished for many centuries and taken care of pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And so although there were times when it was displayed hanging from a balcony with weights on the end of it to keep it from flapping in the breeze, not since probably the 15th or 16th century had they done that. But so, to hold the cloth in your hand, I guess from a purely scientific point of view, we now know a lot more about DNA. We all left our DNA all over that cloth. And so, I would strongly urge us not to put our hands on it without particular proper clothing, gloves, and that kind of thing, just because the DNA that's on the cloth represents anybody who's ever breathed on it, leaned over it, touched it.
That's a good point.
So the contamination factor is so vast that, when you talk about DNA and cloning Jesus from the blood of the shroud, well, in 2002, there was a restoration done on the shroud, and a Swiss textile expert, Madame Fleury Lemberg, spent 31 days handling the cloth, again, without gloves, without a mask or anything, breathing on it. So I'm afraid if we were to do a DNA analysis of the majority of DNA that's immediately found on the shroud, we would find it comes from a Swiss woman instead of a first-century man.
Yeah,
so I think DNA is one of the things that people like to know about because we hear about it every day on our TV programs, but I think it's one of the things that may never yield any kind of viable, conclusive result just because of the contamination factor, notwithstanding the fact that the DNA analysis that has been done on the shroud shows that it is male, it is human, and the DNA is so degraded, which one would expect from at least 700-year-old, if not 2,000-year-old DNA, that no DNA profile could ever be determined, so no DNA analysis could be performed, remembering that DNA analysis is primarily a comparative analysis where you're comparing one sample of DNA to another. Well, we don't have a sample of the DNA of Jesus, so we have nothing to compare it to.
Good point. Barrie, we've got a lot of people who know about the Shroud of Turin, obviously, but
sure.
We got some people who are in their 20s and they don't know what the Shroud of Turin is.
Sure.
Just take a few minutes and tell us what it is.
Well, the Shroud of Turin is a 14.5-foot long, 3.5-foot wide sheet of ancient woven linen. It's a herringbone weave, 3/2 twill, I think it's called. Not typical of a inexpensive cloth, but more typical of an expensive first-century cloth. Herringbone twill actually goes back well before the first century, and samples of it have been found going back hundreds of years before first century. So it was not unknown in first century, but it was a kind of a higher-end, more expensive piece of cloth. Now, the thing about the shroud, of course, that's unique is that it bears the image, front and back, of a man. Now, people often ask me, how did that happen? How did we get a ventral and dorsal front and back image onto one sheet of cloth? Well, it was a very long piece of cloth. The body was laid into the cloth with the head toward the center and the feet at the end. Then the cloth was brought over the head and back down to the feet, remembering that the body's inside, so whatever image formation mechanism created the image acted in relative distance between the cloth and the body and left an image of a man on the shroud.
Remarkable. Okay, and when we come back, I want to talk with you, Barrie, about your work and how you got involved with it. What websites would you like us to peruse? I've got a couple for you.
Well, the most important one relevant to the subject matter is www.shroud.com.
Okay.
SHROUD.
When we come back, we'll talk about Barrie's work as the official documenting photographer of the Shroud of Turin Research Project, and we'll also get into why people believe it is indeed the image of Jesus. I'm George Norrie, and we'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. With our special guest tonight, Barrie Schwortz, as we talk about Turin. Barrie, why do some people, so many people, believe that the shroud has the image of Jesus on it?
Well, George, one of the things that's unique about the shroud is that it clearly depicts a man who has been tortured in a very specific and dramatic fashion. First of all, the man's face has been beaten. You can see the bruises in one cheekbone, both cheekbones swollen, one more than the other. There are scourge marks on the body in the shape of the lead weights that were used on a Roman flagrum. They are sort of dumbbell-shaped weights. There are about 120 of those on the man's body of the shroud, both on the back and on the front, because, when you're whipping somebody, if you get a little closer, it's going to whip around to the front of the body. So there's scourge marks that even on the front of the body. There is also on the body blood stains on the head, as if from some cap or crown. The cap would be more accurate, of thorns that were placed there. There are many open wounds on the head that have bled.
Now, was that standard torture procedure in that day?
It was not.
It was not.
As a matter of fact, that's one of the issues that sort of hooked me into it a little bit, because, the Romans crucified, and by the way, there are crucifixion wounds in the wrists and in the feet, and there is a large spear wound in the side. Now, the crucifixion wounds, common, because they crucified thousands of people. Even the spear in the side might have been done from time to time to see if a victim was still alive, or to make sure, or to finish them off, perhaps. Even the scourging might have been common at that point in time. But the crowning with a cap of thorns, to me, in my mind, the only person that we know of in any kind of documented history, and we have 4 gospel accounts that generally tell the story of what happened to Jesus and are reasonably consistent in that specific area particularly. And that's the thing that sort of leads people to accept that this is the cloth that wrapped the body of Jesus after he was taken from the cross.
What I find so remarkable about this is, for example, if they ever really find Noah's Ark, if they really authenticate the Shroud of Turin, and you may say later, well, we have, it really tells you that the stories in the Bible, which talk about these incredible events, probably is true. Now, I know on faith we can all assume it's true. But when you start seeing the hard evidence, like they find the Ark, or they find the Shroud of Turin and authenticate it, then you begin to say, you know what, the whole thing could be true. And that, to me, Barrie, is the incredible story.
Well, I think there's certainly a basis of truth in the Bible. I mean, obviously, it may not be, it's certainly not exactly a history book, although I know there are people who would disagree with that. But from my point of view, when we talk about the Shroud of Turin, George, science will never be able to prove who that man is. So the ability to truly authenticate it, the way we would using modern forensic techniques with a serial killer or something like that, we're never going to be able to do that. We can never prove who the man on the shroud is, and I typically say in my lectures that even if we had Jesus' mugshot and DNA and fingerprints, there would still be skeptics. So so I don't know that we can ever truly and absolutely authenticate it.